Hi, friends. I hope you all are well. I want to share some thoughts today on cross bearing. I'm referring to Jesus' various statements in the Gospels about taking up your cross. And first century Jews were familiar with cross bearing. It referred to the part of the crucifixion ceremony or the crucifixion procedure where the criminal would be forced to carry their crossbeam. It would be tied onto their back and they would be forced to carry it. The crossbeam was a horizontal bar on the cross, and to carry it through a really busy street so as to amplify the humiliation of the victim and also to amplify the fear that it struck in the heart of the community, lest anybody else try the same thing. And first century Jews were familiar with crucifixion. There were crucifixions that took place undoubtedly during the time of Jesus when he was still alive. Just before the time of Jesus, many crucifixions took place during a period where there was an intensification of resistance movements and uprisings to try to overthrow Rome. But generally, there were two kinds of what they would refer to as martyrs at the time, or crucifixions under Rome. The first were the zealots, the revolutionaries who would attempt to, like I said, overthrow Rome. And the second were the martyrs, like in 2 Maccabees 7, those who died in loyalty to God and to the Torah and to the covenant, because they were unwilling to compromise what God had ordained, just because of foreign oppression and things like the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, when he forced them to abandon the Torah, to eat meat sacrificed to idols, etc., etc. And those who refused were killed. So I want to bring this up because this is a confusing subject. It can be difficult to reconcile for Westerners because we've had such a safe place from persecution and, in reality, even from marginalization. Recently, you can argue that there's been some marginalization, but not like what anybody experienced in the ancient world or what currently many experience in the Muslim world. So why is this confusing? So first of all, I'll ask, I think, what is an important question. Did the Enlightenment and the fruit of the Enlightenment, being democracy, being the emphasis on human rights and things like this, did they fundamentally alter Jesus' invitation to be a disciple? In other words, when we call men to discipleship, to be a disciple and to follow Jesus, does it mean that we no longer have to imply what the cross implies? Taking up the cross could have only meant one thing. It meant to accept martyrdom. Is that no longer relevant? Do we even have to bring this up anymore? That's kind of the subject that I want to bring up. So first, I want to highlight the myth that the reason we don't have any suffering is because we have such an advanced society that is accepted, the idea of human rights and religious freedom. I remember a story years ago where I heard of Francis Chan tell the story that he was visiting China and he was with some underground leaders there, and he asked them if they had a message they wanted to convey to the church in America, and he would convey it as he traveled. And one of them said, yes. He said, I've been watching some videos and I've read some sermons, and it seems that there's some confusion. He said, it sounds like in America, many believe that it's illegal to believe in Jesus. He goes, that's not the case. He goes, if all we did was believe in Jesus and the various tenets of the New Testament, we wouldn't suffer persecution either. In fact, if we kept Jesus to ourselves like Americans tend to keep Jesus to themselves, life would be pretty peaceful for us as well. And I think that actually plays a large part in the idea that we are free from persecution is nothing that really resembles the gospel that Jesus and the apostles preached about a coming day of judgment, and God's only means of being free from this day of wrath being a Jewish man who's going to return and reign from Mount Zion. If we began to preach that here, we'd see how quickly our freedom from persecution probably dissolved. But that said, this is not a problem that's exclusive to the West or to modernity. There's examples like in Hebrews 10, where the author's reminding them of a period of time when their faith was so sincere that they willfully entered into basically to identify with certain prisoners and their following of Jesus, that they willfully accept persecution, even the confiscation of their property. And he was exhorting them to go back to that place of sincerity in their following Jesus. And likewise, you have in 1 Corinthians 4, where Paul is explaining his own suffering and the suffering of his apostolic cohort. And he says, we're the scum of the earth. We're seen as the least and not the greatest. We're the dregs of all things, and people dishonor us, and we don't have any honor. But the conclusion isn't that they should be acknowledged as special and unique. The conclusion is Paul pleads with them that they would imitate him. He says, I plead with you as your father in the gospel, that you would learn to imitate me in these things, not to see me as unique and special. So while it can't logically mean, like in Luke 9, taking up your cross daily, can't logically mean physical death every day. That doesn't make any sense. It still clearly implies the acceptance of death for Jesus' sake. The acceptance of suffering up into and including martyrdom for Jesus' sake and for the gospel's sake. In Luke 9, saving or losing one's life was the explanatory statement of taking up the cross. To take up your cross meant to lose your life now for his sake and for the gospel's sake. And to save your life meant to not take up the cross. So this brings a touchy subject. Many of you know I didn't grow up in the U.S. And so it's not that it's foreign to me because I experienced persecution, but how religiously being an American Christian has become so associated with a fight for religious freedom. In other words, to fight to ensure that there is not persecution. While that also includes, obviously, for groups like Muslims and Jews, primarily the fight for religious freedom by Christians is about the marginalization and suffering of Christians in America, to make sure our voice isn't silenced and to make sure our rights are not taken away, and that by virtue of being Jesus' disciples, we are not stripped of any rights that others have. And while I'm grateful for the measure of liberty that I have and that we have right now, number one, the apostles knew nothing about a fight to preserve religious liberty, obviously. And secondly, I'm not going to live as though I assume that this will continue. It certainly will not continue forever. And so I exhort others in the same way. It reminds me of a story that actually comes to mind frequently. I heard a missionary speaking one time. He's a missionary in the Middle East, and he was speaking to a group of pastors and leaders here in the U.S. And he was speaking about the dynamic of supporting missionaries in the Muslim world who labor amongst Muslims in Muslim cultures. To invite a Muslim to be a disciple, he was explaining, is essentially to invite a Muslim to embrace suffering and persecution, marginalization, rejection, often poverty, sometimes destitution, sometimes imprisonment, and sometimes death. That was inherent in the invitation to be a disciple of Jesus. Inherent in the invitation is the statement, Eternal life is greater than your life now. Giving up your life now is sufficient, or it's not a waste because of the supremacy of eternal life in the age to come. And he said, and sometimes it stands out, the willingness of Americans to send their money essentially amounts to inviting Muslims to embrace a path of discipleship that we are fighting hard to not have to embrace ourselves. The hypocrisy is hard to miss, though I understand that we've not seen it this way. I'm making this in an effort to encourage us that whether it's here or it's overseas, the invitation that we give to non-disciples to embrace following Jesus and all that that entails in order that we might inherit eternal glory in the age to come must come from a place of integrity. We must invite people to follow, to join us on the path that we have already entered into, that we are already on. We cannot say, go and follow Jesus in a way that I am not willing to follow. That's logically, it lacks integrity. So Peter, likewise, this is not, it's not to say that the fact that we've lost this as a premise for following Jesus is also, like I mentioned in Hebrews 10 or 1 Corinthians 4, we also have, like in 1 Peter 4, verse 12, where Peter has to remind them that they were already told this was coming. Why do they think a strange thing is happening? I'd kind of like to leave that same reminder that when persecution comes, and it will come even to America, when resistance, marginalization, persecution, imprisonment, even death comes because of our allegiance to Jesus, a strange thing is not happening. It's not as though God has failed to somehow create this utopia of this religious sanctuary of freedom. It's that Jesus always told us, and the apostolic witness always handed down, that this was going to be the case. Embracing the cross, embracing marginalization because of our proclamation was always part of the deal. And so I'd like to remind us that we revisit this commitment to forsake this life in order to have eternal life in the next. This was always the calling of discipleship. And when we've said yes to this, the idea of suffering and the idea of the cross fits very well within that. If that's not the gospel we accepted, it's time to go back and look at the words of Jesus. So to accept, I'd like to leave us with this. My conclusion in looking at these things is to accept Jesus' fundamental call to be a disciple, included the commitment to follow Jesus up to and including whatever marginalization, suffering, and even death that came, because fundamentally at the core of Jesus' message was the promise of resurrection. And thus, this became a demonstration of the authenticity of the faith of the disciple. And it is for us, and it will be increasingly for us in the days ahead. And number two, that this commitment was often seen in the proclamation of Jesus' words, not simply in the believing of the gospel. And so I'd like to exhort us to reconsider if we have embraced Jesus' words, or if we have forgotten, like some of the men in the New Testament did, if we've forgotten the context of the invitation to be disciples, and to encourage us once again to sign up to embrace following Jesus, the denial of self, the taking up of the cross for Jesus' sake, and not being ashamed of him, not being ashamed of his words, but more and more as we see the day drawing near, to proclaim his coming, to proclaim his death and his soon return. So guys, this is a message that I have been stirred with, so I hope this has been provoking to you as well. As always, You can leave me questions or comments wherever you see the video posted. Lord be with you.